At 2:47 in the afternoon on May 18, 1943, Feldwebel Carl Fischer stepped off a transport train at Fort Reno, Oklahoma, and saw something that contradicted everything the Reich had told him for 10 years. The train platform was clean, not just swept, clean. No debris, no litter, no oil stains on the concrete. The wooden benches along the platform showed fresh paint. The station building behind them had windows, actual glass windows, unbroken. Fischer stood motionless for 5 seconds, his boots still touching the metal step of the train car, and tried to reconcile what his eyes were showing him with what his brain had been trained to believe. The American guards standing 30 yards away wore pressed uniforms. Their boots were polished, not scuffed, not caked with mud, polished to a shine that caught the afternoon sun. They were not starving, they were not desperate, they looked bored. One of them was actually overweight. Fischer had not seen an overweight person in 4 years. The guard carried a clipboard and was walking toward the train with the casual stride of a man who had done this 100 times before. No urgency, no hatred in his eyes, just routine. Fischer was 24 years old. He had been captured 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia when the Afrika Korps surrendered to British forces. He had spent the previous 19 days crossing the Atlantic on a Liberty ship, then riding trains across America from New York to Oklahoma. Every mile had been a contradiction. Cities with lights on at night, farms with tractors that looked new, people on the streets who looked well-fed, who walked without the hunched desperation of the starving. Towns with shops that had goods in the windows. Factories with smoke rising from their stacks, proof of production, proof of an economy that was not collapsing. The propaganda ministry had told him America was eating itself from the inside, that the capitalist system had failed, that rationing had reduced the population to near starvation, that industrial production had ceased because the workforce was too weak to operate the machinery, that the cities were dark at night because there was no fuel for the generators. Fischer had believed it because he had no reason not to. The Reich did not lie to its soldiers. The Reich was building a new world order. The Reich represented the future. America represented decay. Now he stood on a train platform in the middle of nowhere and watched a fat sergeant walk toward him carrying a clipboard. The sergeant began calling names. His voice was loud, but not harsh. He pronounced the German names carefully, respectfully, as if they mattered. As each prisoner's name was called, they stepped forward and were directed toward waiting trucks. Fischer's name was called 14th. He walked to the truck and climbed into the back with 11 other men. The truck bed was clean, no rust. No mud caked on the metal floor. The canvas cover had no tears. The tires had full tread. Fischer sat on a wooden bench that ran along the side of the truck bed and looked at his hands. They were filthy. His fingernails were black with accumulated grime. His uniform was stiff with salt and sweat from the ocean crossing. The fabric was rotting at the seams. His boots had holes in both soles. He had wrapped them with strips of cloth torn from his blanket to keep the sand out during the final weeks in Tunisia. The truck started moving. Through the canvas opening at the back, Fischer watched Oklahoma pass by, fields of wheat stretching to the horizon. The wheat was green, growing healthy, cattle grazing in pastures. Real cattle, not the skeletal animals he had seen in North Africa. Farm equipment that looked maintained, painted, functional. No bomb craters, no destroyed buildings, no columns of refugees walking along the roads with everything they owned on their backs. Just a landscape that looked untouched by war. The truck drove for 3 miles. Fischer counted the telephone poles. He had nothing else to do, and counting gave him something to focus on besides the growing realization that everything he had been told was wrong. They passed through the camp gates. A guard checked paperwork and waved them through without speaking. The truck continued another 1/4 mile and stopped at a processing building. The prisoners were ordered out. They formed into ranks and waited. An American officer appeared. He was perhaps 50 years old with grey hair and a face that showed no emotion. Colonel Harlan Weatherby. He addressed them in German. His accent was terrible, but the words were clear enough. He explained they were now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. They would be treated according to international law, They would receive the same rations as American troops. They would have access to medical care, recreation facilities, and educational programs. Officers would not be required to work. Enlisted men could volunteer for labor assignments and would be paid 80 cents per day in camp vouchers. Fisher waited for the other part, the part where the officer explained the punishments, the forced labor, the interrogations, the reprisals. It did not come. The officer finished speaking and walked away. The prisoners were taken into the building. Processing took 2 hours. Each man was photographed from the front and side, fingerprinted, issued a prisoner number, asked basic questions about unit rank and capture location. No one was struck. No one was threatened. The American soldiers conducting the processing were professional, efficient, and completely uninterested in displaying any emotion whatsoever. When Fisher's turn came, he answered the questions truthfully. There was no point in lying. The war in North Africa was over. His unit had ceased to exist. His commanding officers were either dead or captured. He had no information of value. The soldier, taking his information, wrote everything down on a form, filed it in a folder, and told Fisher to move to the next station. At the clothing station, Fisher was issued 2 sets of surplus army fatigues. Someone had stenciled PW on the back in white paint. 2 shirts, 2 pairs of socks, underwear, a coat, boots that actually fit. Fisher had been wearing the same uniform for 7 weeks. It smelled like death. The fabric was so stiff with dried sweat and salt that it could almost stand up on its own. His boots were held together with wire and hope. Now an American soldier was handing him clean clothes. Clothes that smelled like soap, boots with no holes, socks without worn-through heels. He took them and did not say anything because he could not think of anything to say that would make sense of what was happening. After clothing issue, the prisoners were taken to the barracks. The building was long, single-story wooden construction with a pitched roof. Inside were rows of bunk beds. Each bed had a mattress, an actual mattress, not a straw-filled sack, 2 blankets, a pillow. The floor was swept. The windows had screens to keep out insects. At the far end of the building was a door marked with a sign Fisher could not read because it was in English. One of the other prisoners, a 19-year-old named Ernst Bauer, opened the door. Fisher followed. It was a latrine, 4 toilets, actual porcelain toilets with seats, 4 sinks with faucets, 4 shower heads mounted on the wall above a tiled floor with a drain. Fisher walked to one of the sinks. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he reached out and turned the handle. Water flowed, not a trickle, not a rusty brown stream, clean water at good pressure. He turned the other handle. The water became hot, actually hot, hot enough to steam in the cool air of the latrine. Fisher had not felt hot running water since leaving Germany 18 months ago. He let it run over his hands. The heat felt strange against his skin, foreign, almost painful after so long without it. He watched the water swirl down the drain and tried to understand what kind of prison gave its captives hot water. Behind him, Ernst Bauer walked up to the showers. Bauer had been conscripted in 1941. He had spent 2 years in North Africa fighting with inadequate equipment and shrinking rations. He had survived dysentery sandstorms and British artillery. He had surrendered expecting execution or slow death in a desert prison camp. Now he was standing in front of indoor plumbing with hot water. Bauer turned to Fisher and asked if this was real. Fisher did not answer because he did not know. An American guard entered the barracks and announced in broken German that dinner would be served in 30 minutes. The prisoners could shower and change clothes if they wanted. The guard left. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then one of the prisoners walked to the showers and turned on the water. The spray was hot. Steam rose. The man stripped off his filthy uniform and stepped under the water. He stood there with his eyes closed and water running down his face for a full minute without moving. Then another prisoner walked to the showers. Then another. Within 5 minutes, all 4 showers were occupied and men were waiting their turn. Fisher waited until a shower opened. He stripped off his uniform and left it in a pile on the floor. He stepped under the spray. The water was hot. 105 degrees Fahrenheit, though Fisher had no way of knowing that exact number. hot enough to redden his skin. He found a bar of soap on a shelf mounted to the wall. Actual soap, not the gritty substitute they had been issued in North Africa that barely lathered. Real soap that smelled like something clean. He lathered his hair and scrubbed his scalp until it hurt. He soaped his body and scrubbed every inch of skin. The water at his feet turned dark brown from the accumulated dirt and salt washing away. He stood under the spray and watched the water circle the drain. And he felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of the world. They had told him the Americans were savages, that they executed prisoners, that the camps were worse than anything the SS operated, that death from starvation or disease was guaranteed within weeks. But here he stood under hot water with real soap while steam rose around him and 7 weeks of filth washed down the drain. He stayed under the water for 12 minutes. He only stepped out because other men were waiting and it felt wrong to take more than his share. He dried off with a towel that had been stacked on a shelf. The towel was clean. It was rough against his skin, but it was clean and it was dry and it smelled like laundry soap. He put on the clean clothes. The fabric felt strange against his skin, soft, not stiff with dried sweat, not rough with accumulated salt, just soft and clean. He folded his old uniform and left it on his bunk. He would never wear it again. He did not know that yet, but some part of him understood that the man who had worn that uniform had died somewhere between the shower and this moment. The prisoners walked to the mess hall. It was another long building with tables and benches arranged in rows. They lined up at a serving counter. American soldiers working behind the counter filled their trays. Fisher received a metal tray divided into sections. The first soldier put 2 pieces of fried chicken on his tray. The second added mashed potatoes. The third added green beans. The fourth added a roll with a pat of butter. The fifth added a piece of pie. Apple pie with a golden crust. Fisher stared at the tray. He had not seen this much food on a plate in 2 years, maybe longer. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten until he was full and could not. Training camp, perhaps. Before deployment. Before the war became real. He sat at a table with Bauer and 4 other men. None of them spoke. They ate. The chicken was hot, seasoned with salt and pepper. The meat fell off the bone. The skin was crispy. The mashed potatoes had gravy. Real gravy made from meat drippings, not the watered-down substitute they had been served in the final months in Africa. The green beans were cooked with bacon. The roll was fresh baked that day, still slightly warm. The butter was real butter, not margarine. The pie had a flaky crust and apples cooked with cinnamon and sugar. Fisher ate everything on his tray. He was still hungry, but the hunger felt different now. Not the grinding emptiness of starvation, just normal hunger. The hunger of a man who could eat again tomorrow. A guard walked past the table and told them in broken German they could have seconds if they wanted. Fisher went back through the line. He received another piece of chicken, more potatoes, another roll. He ate that too. Bauer leaned across the table and said this was more food than he had eaten in 3 days in Tunisia. Another prisoner said it was more than he had eaten in a week. They were not exaggerating. Africa Corps' rations had been cut repeatedly as supply lines collapsed. By the final weeks they were receiving 1 meal per day, sometimes not even that. Hardtack and ersatz coffee, occasionally canned meat that was more preservatives than protein. Here they were being fed fried chicken and apple pie. After dinner the prisoners were allowed to walk around the compound. The camp was enclosed by a wire fence 12 feet tall. Guard towers stood at each corner. Searchlights mounted on the towers would illuminate the compound after dark. But inside the fence, the layout was almost pleasant. Barracks arranged in neat rows, a recreation building, a chapel, a library. Paths between buildings were gravelled and maintained. There were benches, actual benches where men could sit. Fisher walked with Bauer toward the recreation building. They could hear music coming from inside. German music. A familiar melody from before the war. They opened the door and found a room with tables, chairs, and a phonograph playing records. Shelves along one wall held books. Fisher walked closer and saw they were in German. Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann. Books that had been banned or burned or simply vanished during the last 10 years. Another wall had a bulletin board with announcements written in German. Religious services on Sunday, sports activities on Wednesday, educational classes starting next week. A guard sat in the corner reading a newspaper. He looked up when they entered, nodded once, and went back to his reading. Fisher and Bauer sat at a table. Neither spoke for several minutes. They were trying to process what they were experiencing. Everything they had been told about America was wrong. The people were not starving. The economy had not collapsed. The military was not on the edge of defeat. In fact, based on what Fisher had seen crossing the country by train, America was barely touched by the war. No bombed cities, no refugees, no visible signs of shortage or deprivation, just farms and factories and people going about their lives as if the greatest war in human history was happening somewhere far away, which it was. The guard in the corner folded his newspaper and walked over to their table. He pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes and offered them to Fisher and Bauer. They each took one. The guard lit them with a Zippo lighter. The flame was steady. The lighter was clean, well maintained. The tobacco was American, smooth, not harsh like the Turkish tobacco they had been smoking in Africa when they could get tobacco at all. The guard asked in broken German if they needed anything. Fisher said no. The guard nodded and walked back to his chair. Fisher smoked the cigarette slowly. He was trying to understand the guard's behavior. There was no hostility, no contempt. The man had just given captured enemy soldiers cigarettes and asked if they needed anything, like they were guests, not prisoners. That night, Fisher lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The mattress was soft. The blankets were warm. Through the window, he could see a guard tower silhouetted against the night sky. The searchlights swept across the compound every few minutes, methodical and impersonal. He could hear other prisoners talking quietly in the darkness. Some were convinced this was temporary, that the Americans were fattening them up before putting them to work under brutal conditions, that the real camp, the hard camp, was somewhere else, and they would be transferred there once the processing was complete. Others thought this was propaganda, that they were being treated well so they would write letters home describing how good life was in America, that this would demoralize the German population and weaken their will to fight. Fisher did not know what to think. He had spent his entire adult life being told that National Socialism represented the apex of civilization, that Germany was creating a new world order based on strength, discipline, and racial purity, that other nations, especially America, were degenerate and weak, that Jewish influence had corrupted their societies and made them soft. Now he was lying on a clean mattress in a heated barracks after eating more food in one meal than he had eaten in 3 days in Tunisia, and tomorrow he would wake up and do it again. The shower had been hot. The soap had been real. The chicken had been seasoned. The books on the shelf had been German. The guard had offered him a cigarette. These were facts, undeniable physical facts that his senses had confirmed. But they contradicted everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, everything he had been willing to die for. Fisher closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep would not come easily. Not tonight. Not with his brain trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. Not with the foundation of his worldview beginning to crack in ways he could not yet name, but could definitely feel. The last thought he had before finally drifting off was simple and terrible. What if they lied about everything? He did not have an answer. Not yet. But the question was there now, planted in his mind like a seed in fertile soil, and it would grow whether he wanted it to or not. Outside, the searchlight swept past the window again, regular as a heartbeat marking time in a place where time had suddenly become strange and new and full of possibilities Fisher had never imagined could exist. The morning of May the 26th, 1943, marked Carl Fisher's 8th day at Fort Reno. He woke at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Reveille, a habit drilled into him by years of military discipline. The barracks were still dark except for the faint grey light filtering through the screened windows. He could hear Ernst Bauer breathing steadily in the bunk below, and somewhere down the row another prisoner snored softly. Fisher lay there for those 3 minutes staring at the wooden ceiling boards. He had stopped waiting for the real camp to reveal itself. This was the real camp. The hot water was real. The food was real. The mattress beneath him was real. That realization disturbed him more than any brutality could have. At 5:50 the wake-up bell rang. Fisher dressed in his PW stenciled fatigues and walked to the latrine with Ernst. They brushed their teeth with toothpaste provided by the camp, actual toothpaste, Colgate, the same brand American soldiers used. Fisher watched the white foam swirl down the drain and thought about the gritty sand they had used to clean their teeth in Tunisia. Breakfast was served at 6:15 in the mess hall. Fisher walked through the serving line and received his tray. The first server placed 3 scrambled eggs on his plate. The second added 4 strips of bacon. The third gave him 2 slices of toast with a pat of butter. The fourth poured him a cup of coffee from a large metal urn. Real coffee. Not the ersatz substitute made from roasted acorns and chicory that the Wehrmacht had been drinking since 1941. This was actual coffee imported from South America, rich and dark. Fisher sat at a table with Ernst and 4 other prisoners. He cut into the eggs. They were cooked with milk and butter, soft and yellow. The bacon was crispy salted, rendered down to savory strips. The toast was made from white bread, light and airy, nothing like the dense black bread back home. He ate methodically, counting as he chewed. 800 calories for breakfast. That was his full daily ration for the final week in Tunisia. Here it was just the morning meal. Ernst leaned across the table and spoke quietly in German. "Have you noticed that none of the guards watch us eat?" Fisher glanced around the mess hall. 3 American soldiers stood at various positions around the room, but they were talking among themselves, paying no attention to the prisoners. One was reading a newspaper. Another was smoking a cigarette. "They do not fear us," Fisher said. "Should they?" Fisher did not answer. He knew what Ernst was implying. These guards saw them as defeated, harmless, no longer soldiers, but simply men who needed to be fed and housed until the war ended. There was no hatred in their eyes, no contempt, just a kind of professional indifference, as if guarding German prisoners was no different than any other job. That bothered Fisher more than he wanted to admit. At 7:30 a.m. prisoners were allowed to sign up for work details. A sergeant stood at a table in the recreation building with a clipboard calling out available assignments. "Cotton picking, Caldwell Ranch, 15 miles west. Need 8 men. Pays 80 cents per day." Fisher stepped forward. So did Ernst and 6 others. The sergeant checked their names against a roster and made notes. "Truck leaves at 800 hours. Be ready." Fisher had volunteered for a specific reason. He wanted to see what lay beyond the camp fence. He wanted to observe how Americans lived, worked, farmed. He wanted evidence, something he could point to that would confirm what the Reich had told him. Weakness. Inefficiency. A nation on the verge of collapse. He had been a loyal National Socialist for 10 years. He had joined the Hitler Youth at 14. He had believed in the Führer's vision of a new world order. He had marched in rallies and sung the Horst Wessel lied and sworn oaths of absolute loyalty. He needed to believe he had been right to do those things. At 8 o'clock, a flatbed truck pulled up outside the barracks. The prisoners climbed into the back and sat on wooden benches. An American soldier sat in the cab with the driver, a rifle resting casually against his shoulder. The truck drove out through the camp gates past the guard towers, onto a dirt road that cut through fields of wheat. Fisher watched Oklahoma pass by through the gaps in the slatted sides. The land was flat and vast, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Fields of grain rippled in the wind like green ocean waves. Cattle grazed in pastures enclosed by barbed wire fencing. Farm equipment, tractors, plows, combines sat parked near barns, their paint fresh, their metal clean. No bomb craters, no destroyed buildings, no signs of war at all. After 22 minutes, The truck turned onto a smaller road and pulled up to a ranch house. A wooden sign nailed to a post read, "Caldwell Ranch, established 1889. The prisoners climbed out. A man emerged from the house and walked toward them. Thornton Caldwell was 63 years old, tall and lean, with weathered skin and grey hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore work boots, canvas pants, and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands were calloused from decades of manual labor. He looked at the 8 prisoners and nodded once. "Morning, boys," one of the guards translated into German. Caldwell gestured toward a barn. "We've got a cotton field needs picking. I'll show you how it's done. Then you work at your own pace. We take a break every 2 hours for water. Lunch is at noon. Any questions?" No one spoke. "All right then, follow me." They walked to a field where cotton plants grew in long rows, white bolls bursting from green stems. Caldwell showed them how to pull the cotton without damaging the plant, how to stuff it into canvas sacks, how to avoid the sharp edges of the dried bolls. Fisher had grown up on a farm in Bavaria. He knew how to work with crops. The technique was simple. What struck him was Caldwell's demeanor. The man worked alongside them. He did not stand apart and bark orders. He picked cotton, just as they did, moving down the rows with steady efficiency, occasionally stopping to offer advice or demonstrate a better method. At 10 o'clock, Caldwell called for a break. He walked to a water pump near the barn and filled a bucket, then carried it to the field with a metal ladle. Each prisoner drank. The water was cold, drawn from deep underground. Caldwell drank too, using the same ladle. Fisher watched this carefully. In the Wehrmacht, officers never shared utensils with enlisted men. In the SS, the racial hierarchy was even more rigid. Yet here was an American, a civilian, a ranch owner with property and wealth drinking from the same ladle as captured enemy soldiers. Ernst noticed it too. He glanced at Fisher with a look that said, "Do you see this?" Fisher saw it. He did not know what to make of it. At noon, a woman emerged from the ranch house carrying a basket. She was in her late 50s, with brown hair turning grey and a kind face marked by years of sun exposure. She wore a simple dress and an apron. Vivian Caldwell. She walked to the field and set the basket down in the shade of an oak tree. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in wax paper apples and a glass jug of lemonade. Through the translator, she said, "Help yourselves, gentlemen." The prisoners hesitated. Then Ernst stepped forward, took a sandwich and bit into it. Ham and cheese on white bread with mustard. The others followed. Fisher took a sandwich and an apple. He sat on the ground beneath the tree and ate slowly. The ham was thick-sliced real meat, not the preserved scraps they had received in Africa. The bread was soft. The cheese was sharp cheddar. He ate and watched Vivian Caldwell pour lemonade into tin cups and hand them to each prisoner. She smiled as she did so. Not a forced smile, not a gesture of superiority or charity, just a natural kindness. When she reached Fisher, she said something in English. He did not understand, but the translator said, "She asks if you need anything else." Fisher shook his head. "Nein, danke." She nodded and moved on. They worked until 4 o'clock. By the end of the day, Fisher's hands were raw and his back ached, but the labor was not unbearable. It was honest work, no different from the farm chores he had done as a boy. Caldwell inspected their sacks, weighed the cotton, and made notes in a ledger. Then he paid them each 80 cents in camp vouchers, small slips of paper they could exchange at the canteen. As they climbed back into the truck, Caldwell called out, "You boys did good work today. See you tomorrow." Fisher sat on the bench as the truck drove back toward Fort Reno. He looked at the voucher in his hand. 80 cents, American money, payment for labor performed. He was a prisoner of war captured by the enemy, and they were paying him wages. Ernst leaned over and said quietly, "In Tunisia, we were not paid. We were barely fed. Here they give us money for picking cotton." "It is propaganda," Fisher said. But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. That evening, after dinner, Fisher returned to his bunk and lay down to rest. Around him, other prisoners talked quietly, played cards, or read books from the camp library. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost comfortable. Then a voice cut through the murmur. "Attention, all German personnel. Formation outside in 5 minutes." Fisher sat up. The voice had spoken in German, crisp and commanding. He recognized the tone, an officer giving orders. He walked outside with Ernst and the others. About 30 prisoners had gathered in a space between two barracks. Standing before them was a man Fisher had not seen before. Hauptmann Wolfgang Steiner. He was 35 years old, lean and hard, with pale blue eyes and blonde hair cropped close to his skull. He wore the same PW fatigues as everyone else, but he carried himself differently. His posture was rigid, military, unyielding. Even in captivity, he radiated authority. Steiner had been captured in the same Tunisia offensive as Fisher, but as an officer he had been housed separately and processed through different channels. Now he stood before the enlisted men like a commander addressing his troops. "Soldiers of the Reich," Steiner began, his voice cold and precise. "I know what the Americans are doing. They are trying to break you. They feed you. They house you. They pay you. They treat you with what they call humanity. This is psychological warfare. They want you to forget who you are. They want you to betray your oaths." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You are not guests here. You are prisoners. You are soldiers of Germany. Your duty has not ended just because you were captured. Your duty is to resist, to maintain discipline, to remain loyal to the Führer and the fatherland." Fisher stood very still, listening. Steiner continued. "I am forming a resistance organization within this camp. We will refuse to cooperate beyond the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. We will collect intelligence. We will maintain our military structure. We will ensure that when this war is won, we return to Germany as soldiers, not as traitors seduced by American comfort." Several prisoners nodded. A few murmured agreement. Steiner's gaze swept across the group. "I need men who remember their honor. Men who have not been corrupted. I will meet with volunteers tonight at 2200 hours in Barracks 7. Do not speak of this to the guards." He turned and walked away. Fisher stood there as the crowd dispersed. Ernst stayed beside him. "Are you going?" Ernst asked quietly. Fisher did not answer immediately. Part of him wanted to go. Part of him wanted to stand with Steiner and reclaim the certainty he had felt before the shower, before the hot water, before the chicken and pie. But another part of him, a growing insistent part, knew that Steiner was offering him a lie to replace a lie. "I do not know," Fisher said finally. At 10 o'clock that night, Fisher found himself walking toward Barracks 7. He told himself he was going to observe to see who attended to understand what Steiner was planning. He told himself he was not going because he wanted to believe again. Inside the barracks, 12 men had gathered. Steiner stood at the center, speaking in low tones. When Fisher entered, Steiner paused and studied him. "Feldwebel Fisher," Steiner said. "I know your record. Africa Corps, decorated twice. A loyal soldier." Fisher said nothing. Steiner gestured for him to sit. "We are organizing resistance efforts, small acts of defiance, slow work production, collect information about American operations, maintain our unity as German soldiers." One of the other men spoke up. "What if they punish us? Cut our rations? Put us in isolation?" "Then we endure it," Steiner said sharply. "Suffering builds character. Comfort breeds weakness. Look at what is happening here. Men are forgetting their purpose. They laugh with the guards. They take American money. They attend English classes. This is how empires fall, not by force, but by seduction." Fisher listened. Steiner's words had the rhythm of ideology, the cadence of propaganda. They were designed to inspire, to rally, to provide certainty in an uncertain world. But Fisher had noticed something. Steiner had not mentioned the food. He had not mentioned the medical care, the clean water, the fact that every man in this room was healthier now than when he had arrived. Steiner was asking them to ignore reality in favor of belief. The meeting ended after 20 minutes. Steiner assigned tasks, observe guard routines, track American supply deliveries, discourage prisoners from fraternizing. Fisher was assigned to monitor work details and report any intelligence gathered. He walked back to his own barracks in silence. Ernst was waiting. "What happened?" Ernst asked. Fischer sat on his bunk. "Steiner wants us to resist." "Resist what?" "Kindness," Fischer said quietly. "He wants us to resist kindness." Ernst frowned. "That does not make sense." "No," Fischer agreed. "It does not." Over the next 3 weeks, Fischer worked at Caldwell Ranch 5 days a week. The routine became familiar. Wake at dawn, breakfast. Truck to the ranch, work in the fields or mending fences or hauling hay. Break for water. Lunch. More work. Return to camp by late afternoon. On his 3rd week, something changed. Thornton Caldwell approached Fischer while he was repairing a section of fence near the pasture. The old rancher watched him work for a moment, then said through the translator, "You know your way around tools?" Fischer nodded. "I grew up on a farm." "Can you drive?" "I drove trucks in the army." Caldwell gestured toward a tractor parked near the barn. "Come with me." For the next hour, Caldwell taught Fischer how to operate the tractor. It was a John Deere Model B painted green and yellow with a gasoline engine and a manual transmission. Fischer learned to work the clutch shift gears, steer the heavy machine across uneven ground. By the end of the lesson, he was driving it competently. Caldwell nodded with satisfaction. "Good. You'll be my tractor man from now on. Pull the cotton trailer while the others pick." Fischer spent the next 2 weeks driving the tractor. It was easier work than picking by hand, and it gave him time to think. He drove up and down the rows while prisoners filled their sacks and dumped cotton into the trailer. The engine rumbled steadily beneath him. The Oklahoma sun beat down, and as he drove he thought about what Steiner had said, about resistance, about maintaining loyalty, about refusing to be seduced by American comfort. But Fischer was not sure it was seduction. It felt more like fairness. On June 15th, 1943, Caldwell called Fischer over during the lunch break. The rancher was standing near the barn, holding a photograph. Through the translator, he said, "I want to show you something." The photograph showed 2 young men in U.S. Army uniforms. Both were in their 20s, clean-shaven, smiling at the camera. "My sons," Caldwell said. "Thomas is in North Africa with Patton's army. David is in England training for the invasion." Fischer stared at the photograph. Thomas and David Caldwell, American soldiers, fighting against Germany. He looked up at Thornton Caldwell and saw no anger in the man's face, no hatred, just a father's worry. "You have sons fighting my country," Fischer said through the translator. "And yet you treat us well." Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My boys are over there fighting, but I don't blame you for that. War's bigger than any of us." Fischer had no response to that. Caldwell put the photograph back in his pocket. "Come on, let's get back to work." That night, Fischer lay in his bunk and thought about the photograph. He thought about Thomas and David Caldwell somewhere in the world wearing American uniforms, fighting German soldiers. He thought about Thornton Caldwell feeding German prisoners, teaching them to drive tractors, treating them like human beings, even while his own sons were in danger. It made no sense according to the ideology Fischer had been taught. According to the Reich, Americans were weak, sentimental, incapable of the necessary hardness required for war. But Caldwell was not weak. He was strong enough to separate the men in front of him from the nation they had fought for. Strong enough to see them as individuals, not as abstractions. That Fischer realized required a different kind of strength, a strength the Reich had never taught him about. On June 22, 1943, Fischer attended his first monthly medical examination. All prisoners were required to see the camp physician for health assessments. The doctor was a U.S. Army captain named Harrison, a middle-aged man with grey temples and a calm demeanor. He examined Fischer with professional efficiency, checked blood pressure, listened to his heart and lungs, looked at his eyes and throat, palpated his abdomen. Then he had Fischer step on a scale. 158 pounds, Dr. Harrison said in English. The translator repeated it in German. Fischer stared at the number. When he had been captured 8 weeks ago, he had weighed 134 pounds. Malnourished, dehydrated, weakened by months of inadequate rations. He had gained 24 pounds in 8 weeks. Dr. Harrison made notes on a clipboard. Blood pressure normal, heart rate normal, no signs of malnutrition or parasitic infection. You're in good health, soldier. Fisher walked out of the medical office in a daze. He found Ernst waiting outside. How did it go? Ernst asked. I gained 24 pounds. Ernst blinked. How much did you weigh before 134? I gained 18, Ernst said quietly. I weighed 126 when we arrived. Now 144. They stood there in silence, processing the implications. Quantifiable, measurable proof that they were being treated better here than they had been treated by their own military. That evening, Fisher went to the canteen and used his accumulated vouchers, 2 weeks of work at 80 cents per day, $12.80 total, to buy cigarettes and chocolate. The canteen was a small building stocked with items prisoners could purchase. Lucky Strike cigarettes, 20 cents per pack. Hershey's chocolate bars, 5 cents each. Writing paper, 10 cents for a pad. Stamps for letters, 3 cents. Fisher bought 2 packs of Lucky Strikes and 4 chocolate bars. He took them back to his bunk and opened one of the chocolate bars. It was smooth, sweet, rich. Better than any chocolate he had tasted in Germany, even before the war. The Wehrmacht had issued chocolate occasionally, but it was grainy and bitter, made with substitutes to conserve real cocoa for civilian use. This was real chocolate, American chocolate, mass-produced, abundant, available to prisoners. He ate 1 square and felt something inside him shift. On June 30th, Fisher wrote his first letter home. The camp allowed prisoners to send mail once per week, subject to censorship. Fisher sat at a table in the recreation hall with a piece of paper and a pencil. Dear Mother. He stopped. What could he say? How could he describe this place? She would not believe him. No one in Germany would believe him. He tried again. Dear Mother, I am well. I am in a camp in Oklahoma. The conditions are acceptable. I am working on a farm and earning money. I have gained weight. Please write to me if you receive this letter. Your son, Carl. He sealed the letter in an envelope and handed it to the camp censor. 3 weeks later, he received a reply. His mother was alive. His father had been killed in an Allied air raid on Munich in February 1943, just 3 months before Fisher's capture. His younger brother, Peter, was fighting on the Eastern Front. Fisher read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his footlocker. That night, he could not sleep. He thought about his father dead under American bombs. He thought about Peter fighting Russians in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. And here he was, gaining weight, eating chocolate driving tractors for an old American rancher who treated him like a hired hand instead of an enemy. The guilt was crushing. On July 3rd, 1943, Thornton Caldwell made an announcement to the work crew. Tomorrow's the 4th of July, Independence Day, big holiday in America. The ranch doesn't operate on the 4th, but I'd like to invite you boys to come to the house for a barbecue. If you want to, that is. No pressure. The translator relayed this in German. Fisher glanced at Ernst. A barbecue. At the Americans' home. On their national holiday. Steiner's voice echoed in his mind. Do not fraternize. Do not be seduced. But Fisher was tired. Tired of resistance. Tired of ideology. Tired of pretending that what he was experiencing was not real. I will go, he said. Ernst nodded. So will I. July 4th, 1944, dawned hot and clear across Oklahoma. Carl Fisher woke at his usual time, but there was no work today. No truck to the Caldwell Ranch. No cotton to pick or fences to mend. Instead, at 10 o'clock in the morning, a different truck arrived at Fort Reno. Thornton Caldwell sat in the driver's seat wearing a clean shirt and his best hat. He waved at the 8 prisoners who had volunteered to come. Fisher climbed into the truck bed with Ernst and the others. As they drove through the camp gates, he felt a strange nervousness in his chest. He was going to an American's home, on their most important holiday, to celebrate their independence, their victory over an empire that had tried to control them. The irony was not lost on him. The Caldwell house was a two-story structure with white clapboard siding and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. American flags hung from the porch posts, red and white stripes rippling in the breeze. In the yard, picnic tables had been set up under the shade of oak trees. Vivian Caldwell emerged from the house carrying a tray of glasses. She smiled when she saw the truck pull up. "Welcome, gentlemen," she said through the translator who had come along. "Make yourselves comfortable. Food will be ready soon." Fisher and the others stood awkwardly near the truck. They were prisoners, enemy soldiers. What were they supposed to do at an American holiday celebration? Thornton Caldwell solved the problem by handing Fisher a glass of lemonade and gesturing toward the tables. "Sit, relax. You've earned a day off." Fisher sat. He drank the lemonade cold tart sweet. He watched as Caldwell walked to a brick barbecue pit and began arranging charcoal. Smoke rose into the blue sky. Over the next hour, neighbors began arriving. 3 other farming families from the area, all of whom Caldwell had invited. They came with covered dishes, potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans, corn on the cob. They greeted the German prisoners with polite nods, no hostility in their eyes, just curiosity. One elderly woman approached Fisher and asked through the translator, "Where in Germany are you from, young man?" "Bavaria," Fisher said. "Oh, I've heard it's beautiful there, the mountains." Fisher nodded, unsure how to respond. She was making small talk with him, as if he were a guest, as if there were no war. Caldwell placed thick steaks on the grill. The smell of cooking meat filled the yard. Fisher's mouth watered. He had not eaten beef since before Tunisia. In Africa, they had subsisted on canned rations and whatever they could scavenge. Beef was a distant memory. At noon, Vivian Caldwell called everyone to the tables. The food was laid out in abundance: steaks, grilled chicken, potato salad, coleslaw, beans, corn, fresh bread, butter, and 3 different pies for dessert. Fisher sat at a table between Ernst and one of the American farmers. He was handed a plate and told to help himself. He took a steak, a piece of chicken, spoonfuls of the various sides. His plate was full. More food than he had seen on one plate in 2 years. As he ate, Fisher looked around. To his left, Ernst was talking with the translator, asking questions about Oklahoma farming. To his right, the American farmer was cutting his steak and talking about the wheat harvest. Across the table, Vivian Caldwell was serving pie to one of the other prisoners. And on the porch of the house, Fisher saw a framed photograph sitting on a small table. He recognized it: Thomas and David Caldwell in their army uniforms, the sons who were fighting in Europe, who might at this very moment be shooting at German soldiers, who might be killing Fisher's own brother, Peter, on the Eastern Front. And yet here sat Fisher, eating their father's food, welcomed into their home. The contradiction was unbearable. After the meal, Thornton Caldwell stood and made a short speech. The translator relayed it in German. "Today we celebrate the founding of our nation, a nation built on the idea that all men are created equal, that they have certain rights that can't be taken away. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We've had to fight for those ideas more than once. We're fighting for them now." He paused and looked directly at the German prisoners. "But I don't believe those ideas belong only to Americans. I think they belong to everyone. And I think that when this war is over, we'll all need to remember that. The men sitting at this table are my enemies in name, but they're not evil. They're just men. And men can change. Men can learn. Men can be better than the governments that sent them to war." There was silence when he finished. Then one of the American neighbors began clapping. Others joined in. It was not applause for a speech. It was acknowledgement of something difficult and true. Fisher sat frozen steak halfway to his mouth. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, fireworks started going off in the distance. The town of El Reno, 12 miles away, was celebrating with explosions of color against the darkening sky. Fisher stood in the yard watching the fireworks. Red, white, and blue bursts of light, the colors of the American flag, the colors of victory. Thornton Caldwell walked over and stood beside him. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Fisher, in his broken English he had been learning for a year now, asked the question that had been burning in his chest all day. You hate us. Your sons fight. My country. Caldwell looked at him. In the fading light, the old rancher's face was lined and weathered, marked by decades of hard work and hard decisions. No, Caldwell said simply. I don't hate you. Fisher struggled with the English words. But they fight. They maybe die. Because of Germany. Because of us. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You didn't start this war any more than my boys did. You're all just caught up in something bigger than any of you. Something that old men decided and young men have to die for. He turned to face Fisher fully. When this is over, I hope people can go back to being people instead of enemies. That's all. Fisher felt something break inside him. Not violently, not dramatically. Just a quiet crumbling like a wall made of sand collapsing under its own weight. He excused himself and walked to the edge of the property away from the tables and the laughter and the fireworks. He stood there in the gathering darkness and cried for the first time since his capture. He cried because Thornton Caldwell was a better man than most of the officers Fisher had served under, because Vivian Caldwell had served him pie with the same kindness she showed her neighbors, because everything he had been told about Americans was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was wrong? What else had been a lie? Ernst found him 20 minutes later. Carl, you all right? Fisher wiped his face. They're better than us. What? The Americans. They're better than us, better than the Reich, better than everything we were told. Ernst said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, I know. That night back at Fort Reno, Fisher could not sleep. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling while around him other prisoners snored and shifted in their sleep. His mind replayed the day, the food, the conversation, Caldwell's words. You didn't start this war. But Fisher had participated in it. He had worn the uniform. He had followed orders. He had truly believed that Germany was right, that the Führer was leading them towards something glorious, that the enemies they fought were inferior, weak, deserving of conquest. 10 years of belief, 10 years of certainty, and one barbecue in Oklahoma had shattered it. The guilt was crushing. Not guilt for being captured, not guilt for surviving, guilt for having believed in the first place. Over the next 2 weeks, Fisher went through the motions. Work at the ranch, meals at camp, English lessons in the evening. But inside, he was at war with himself. Part of him wanted to cling to what he had been taught, the ideology, the certainty, the sense of purpose that came from believing you were part of something greater than yourself. But another part, a growing, insistent part, knew that purpose had been built on lies. Ernst noticed the change. You've been quiet, he said one evening as they sat in the recreation hall. I am thinking. About what? Fisher looked at his friend. Ernst was 19 years old. He had been conscripted in 1942, sent to Africa, and captured after barely a year of service. He had spent more time as a prisoner than as a soldier. Do you ever wonder, Fisher said slowly, if we were on the wrong side? Ernst's eyes widened. It was a dangerous question. Even here in an American POW camp there were loyalists, men like Steiner, who would report such talk as defeatism or treason. But Ernst leaned closer and whispered, every day. On July 20th, 1944, news reached the camp that there had been an assassination attempt on Hitler. A bomb had been planted at his headquarters in East Prussia. The Führer had survived. The camp erupted in confusion. Some prisoners celebrated Hitler's survival. Others, a minority, but a growing one, were disappointed. That night, Steiner called another secret meeting. Fisher did not want to go, but he knew that absence would be noted. So he attended. Steiner stood before the assembled men, his face hard with fury. Traitors, he spat. Traitors within our own military tried to kill the Führer. This is what happens when men lose faith, when they are seduced by weakness and doubt. He paced back and forth. Some of you are wavering. I can see it. The Americans have made you comfortable, and you are forgetting your duty. You are forgetting your oaths. His gaze swept across the room and landed on Fisher. Feldwebel Fisher, you have been working at the ranch for over a year. Tell us, have you remained loyal, or have you been compromised? Every eye turned to Fisher. He stood slowly. His heart pounded. This was the moment. He could lie. He could pledge loyalty to Steiner, to the Reich, to the ideology that had defined his entire adult life. Or he could tell the truth. I have been compromised, Fisher said quietly. Steiner's eyes narrowed. Explain. I was told Americans were weak. I have seen that they are strong. I was told they were starving. I have seen that they are prosperous. I was told they were our inferiors. I have seen that they are better than us in ways that matter. Murmurs rippled through the room. Steiner stepped closer. You are a traitor. Perhaps, Fisher said. Or perhaps I am finally seeing clearly. You have betrayed your oath to the Führer. The Führer, Fisher said, and his voice was steady now, lied to us. About everything. Steiner struck him, an open-handed slap across the face. Fisher's head snapped to the side, but he did not fall. You will be reported, Steiner hissed. You will be dealt with when we return to Germany. Fisher met his gaze. I do not think we will return to Germany. I think Germany is losing, and I think men like you will spend the rest of your lives refusing to admit it. He walked out of the meeting. Ernst followed him. Over the next 3 months, Fisher became an outcast among the prisoners. Not from all of them. Ernst stood by him, and a handful of others quietly expressed agreement with what he had said. But the majority avoided him. Steiner's loyalists called him a traitor. Some refused to speak to him. Fisher did not care. He had spent a year living a lie, and he was done with lies. He continued working at the Caldwell Ranch. His English improved. He learned to repair engines, to manage livestock, to operate all the farm equipment. Thornton Caldwell treated him less like a prisoner and more like a trusted employee. In September, Caldwell offered him something unexpected. When this war ends, the old rancher said, you'll be sent back to Germany. But if you want, you could come back here afterward. I'll sponsor you, help you get the paperwork. I need a good hand, and you're the best worker I've had in years. Fisher stared at him. You would do that? For a German? I'd do it for a good man, Caldwell said. Nationality doesn't matter much to me. Fisher thought about the offer for weeks. Go back to America after the war, build a life here, leave Germany behind. It felt like betrayal, but betrayal of what? A regime that had lied to him, a country that had sent him to die in a desert, a system built on hatred and conquest. Or was it betrayal of his family? His mother, his brother Peter, still fighting on the Eastern Front? He did not know. In October 1944, Steiner enacted his plan. Fisher learned about it by accident. He overheard 2 of Steiner's loyalists talking in low voices near the latrine. They were planning to sabotage the Caldwell Ranch, burn the wheat storage barn, a symbolic act of resistance, proof that German soldiers still had fight in them. Fisher felt cold rage flood through him. He found Ernst and told him what he had heard. You have to stop them, Ernst said immediately. How? Tell the guards. Tell Caldwell. I don't care how. But you can't let them hurt that man. That night Fisher did not sleep. He lay in his bunk and thought about Thornton Caldwell, the man who had taught him to drive a tractor, who had shared his lunch, who had invited him to a 4th of July barbecue, who had offered him a future. At 2 in the morning, Fisher heard movement. He opened his eyes and saw shadows slipping out of the barracks. Steiner and 4 others. Fisher rose and followed them. The camp's perimeter was not heavily guarded. The Americans did not expect escape attempts. Where would the prisoners go? Into hostile territory with no money, no food, no knowledge of the language. It was suicide. But Steiner was not trying to escape. He was trying to destroy. Fisher followed the group through a gap in the fence they had cut earlier across a field toward the Caldwell Ranch 2 miles away. By the time they reached the property, it was 3 in the morning. The ranch house was dark. The barn loomed against the starlit sky. Steiner produced a bottle of kerosene from his coat. He doused the side of the barn while the others stood watch. Fisher stepped out of the shadows. "Stop!" Steiner spun around. "Fisher, I should have known you would betray us." "You are the betrayer," Fisher said. "You are betraying everything that matters." "Sentimentality," Steiner spat. "This is war. The man who owns this ranch has sons fighting Germany. He is the enemy. He is a better man than you will ever be." Steiner struck a match. Fisher tackled him. They went down hard, rolling across the dirt. The match flew from Steiner's hand and went out. The other prisoners rushed forward to pull Fisher off, but he fought with desperate strength. "Caldwell!" Fisher shouted in English. "Fire help!" Lights blazed on in the ranch house. Thornton Caldwell appeared on the porch with a rifle. The other prisoners scattered. Only Steiner and Fisher remained locked together on the ground. Caldwell ran toward them, rifle raised. "What the hell is going on?" Fisher released Steiner and stood, hands raised. In broken English he said, "He try, burn barn. I stop him." Caldwell looked at the kerosene-soaked barn, at Steiner lying on the ground, at Fisher standing with his hands up. "You stopped him?" "Yes." Caldwell lowered the rifle. He walked to Fisher and put a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, son." Those two words, "thank you, son," broke something in Fisher. He had betrayed his country. He had fought against a fellow German soldier. He had chosen an American rancher over his own people. And it felt like the first honest thing he had done in years. Steiner was arrested and sent to a maximum security POW facility in another state. The 4 men who had been with him were placed in isolation at Fort Reno. Fisher expected punishment. Instead, Colonel Weatherby called him into his office. "You saved that ranch," the colonel said through a translator. "You could have looked the other way, but you didn't." "Why?" Fisher thought about the question. "Because Thornton Caldwell is a good man, and good men should not suffer for the crimes of bad governments." Weatherby studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're a good man too, soldier." In December 1944, news arrived that Germany had launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge, one final desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. Some prisoners in the camp celebrated. They believed Germany could still win. Fisher knew better. He had been reading American newspapers. He knew the full scope of Allied production, the hundreds of thousands of troops being trained, the vast resources being marshaled. Germany was fighting on 2 fronts against enemies who could replace every loss 10 times over. The war was over. Germany just had not admitted it yet. On April 30th, 1945, news came that Adolf Hitler was dead. Suicide in his bunker as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The camp held a meeting to inform all prisoners officially. Colonel Weatherby stood before them and made the announcement. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few, including Fisher, felt only relief. 7 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. 2 weeks after Germany's surrender, Colonel Weatherby announced a mandatory assembly for all prisoners. A film projector had been set up in the recreation hall. Fisher filed in with the others. No one knew what they were about to see. The lights went out. The projector whirred to life. Newsreel footage appeared on the screen. American soldiers opening gates, the gates of Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. The camera showed what they found inside. Fisher stared at the screen. He could not look away, could not breathe. Skeletal bodies stacked like firewood. Living people who looked like skeletons. Children with hollow eyes. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Crematoria. Mountains of shoes. Mountains of eyeglasses. Mountains of human hair. The numbers appeared on screen. 6 million Jews. Millions of others. Poles, Russians. Roma-disabled political prisoners, homosexuals. Some prisoners in the hall shouted that it was propaganda. American lies. The footage was fake. But Fisher knew it was not fake. He could see it in the eyes of the American soldiers on screen. The horror, the disgust, the way they could barely look at what they were filming. This was real. Ernst sat beside him, crying silently. When the lights came back on, Colonel Weatherby stood at the front of the room. "This is what you fought for," he said quietly. "This is what your government did. Not all of you knew. Maybe most of you didn't know. But now you do." He left the room. Fisher sat there, unable to move. He thought about the oath he had sworn at 14, the rallies, the songs, the belief that Germany was building something great. They had built this instead. That night, Fisher wrote in his diary, the diary he had kept since arriving at Fort Reno. "I wore the uniform. I believed the words. I cannot say I did not know, because I chose not to know. I chose not to ask questions. I chose to believe the lies because they made me feel powerful and right. Today I learned what that choice cost. Not just my own soul, but millions of lives. I cannot undo what was done. But I can choose differently now. I can choose truth over ideology, humanity over nationalism, kindness over certainty." Thornton Caldwell showed me what that looks like. Hot water and soap, a shared ladle, a seat at his table on the 4th of July. That is civilization. Everything else was barbarism dressed in uniforms and flags. Colonel Weatherby explained that repatriation would take time, months, possibly longer. Germany was in chaos. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was gone. Millions of refugees were displaced. The Allies needed to establish order before they could begin returning prisoners. Fisher accepted this. He had nowhere to go anyway. His mother was alive. He had received one letter from her in 1944, but Bavaria was in ruins. He continued working at the Caldwell Ranch. The work was the same. Cattle still needed tending. Fences still needed repair. Crops still needed planting and harvesting. In September, Thornton Caldwell repeated his offer. "When they send you back," he said, "you can come back here if you want. I'll sponsor you, help you immigrate legally." "I need a good hand, Carl, and you're the best I've ever had." Fisher looked at the old rancher. Caldwell was 65 now, still working his land, still strong despite his years. "I must find my mother first," Fisher said. "I must see what is left." "I understand, but the offer stands. Always." In March 1946, Fisher boarded a train for New York. From there, he was placed on a transport ship bound for Bremen, Germany. The crossing took 11 days. Fisher stood on deck as the ship approached the German coast. He could see the destruction from miles away. Bremen was rubble. The harbor was choked with sunken ships and twisted metal. They disembarked and were processed through a British transit camp. Fisher was given travel documents and a small amount of money. He was told he was free to go. Free. After 33 months as a prisoner of war, he took a train south toward Bavaria. The journey that should have taken 1 day took 4. Rail lines were destroyed. Bridges were out. Stations were ruins. Fisher finally reached his village on March 21, 1946. Half the buildings were gone. His family's farmhouse still stood, but the barn had been burned. The fields were untended. His mother was alive. She came to the door when he knocked, and for a moment she did not recognize him. Then she cried and held him. Inside the house, she told him everything. His father had died in the air raid 3 months before Fisher's capture. His brother Peter had been killed on the Eastern Front in March 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Fisher sat at the table where he had eaten breakfast as a child and felt the full weight of what had been lost. Over the next year, Fisher worked the family farm. But Germany was starving. Food rations were 1,200 calories per day, less than a breakfast at Fort Reno. The black market was the only way to survive. Fisher remembered the meals in Oklahoma, the chicken and pie, the steaks at the barbecue, the chocolate bars from the canteen. He had eaten better as a prisoner in America than as a free man in post-war Germany. The irony was bitter. In July 1947, Fisher made his decision. He sat down and wrote a letter to Thornton Caldwell. "Dear Mr. Caldwell, I have returned to Germany and found very little remaining. My father and brother are dead. My mother is alive but struggling. The farm is in poor condition. The country is destroyed. You once offered me a job. Is that offer still good? If so, I would like to accept. Respectfully, Carl Fischer. He mailed the letter and waited. 2 months later, a reply came. Carl, the offer is good. I'm sending the necessary paperwork. Fill it out and send it back. I'll sponsor your immigration. There's a place for you here. Thornton Caldwell. Fisher showed the letter to his mother. She read it and looked at him with tired eyes. Go, she said. There is nothing for you here. At least in America you have a future. But you, I am old. I will manage. You are young. Go live. On April 7th, 1948, Carl Fischer boarded a ship in Bremen bound for New York. He was 28 years old. He carried one suitcase containing everything he owned. The crossing took 10 days. When the ship entered New York harbor and he saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the water, he thought about Thornton Caldwell's words from 4 years earlier. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. He had spent his youth believing those were lies. Now he was coming to America to live by them. Thornton Caldwell met him at the train station in Oklahoma City. The old rancher was 68 now, grayer, slower, but still strong. They shook hands. Then Caldwell pulled him into an embrace. "Welcome home, son." They drove to the ranch. Caldwell showed him the small house on the property where he could live. It had electricity running water, a bathroom with a toilet and a shower. Fisher walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Hot water flowed from the nozzle. Steam rose. He stood there for a moment, remembering the first time. May 18th, 1943. The shower at Fort Reno. The moment everything began to change. He smiled. He was home. Carl Fischer worked at the Caldwell Ranch for 37 years. He became an American citizen in 1953. In 1956, he married Josephine Brennan, a schoolteacher from El Reno. They had 3 children. Thornton Caldwell died in 1974 at the age of 94. His sons took over the ranch and kept Fischer on as foreman until he retired in 1982. In retirement, Fischer gave talks at schools and civic organizations. He spoke about the war, about being captured, about Fort Reno. He always emphasized the same point: he had arrived in Oklahoma expecting brutality and found humanity. In 1989, at the age of 70, Fischer wrote a letter to the Oklahoma Historical Society. He wanted to leave a record. He wanted people to understand what that camp had meant. The letter read, "Everything changed under that shower on May 18th, 1943. When the hot water ran, I felt not just dirt washing away, but lies. Lies about who I should hate, who was superior, what civilization meant. The Reich told me Americans were weak, degenerate, collapsing. Then they gave me their enemy hot water soap food dignity, not because they wanted information, not because they were trying to convert me, just because that was their standard, their baseline for how human beings should be treated. I spent 10 years believing Germany represented the peak of civilization. Then I spent 2 years in Oklahoma learning what civilization actually means. It means treating people with decency even when you don't have to, especially when you don't have to. That shower taught me something I carry to this day. The measure of a society is not its propaganda or its military might. It is how it treats people when they are most vulnerable, even enemies, especially enemies. I came to America as a prisoner and left as a free man. Then I came back as an immigrant and became a citizen. This country gave me more than I ever could have hoped for. But the real gift was not the food or the comfort or the opportunity. The real gift was being shown that I had been wrong, that I had believed in evil while calling it good, that I could change, that people can always choose to be better than they were. That lesson began with hot water and soap, and it saved my life. Carl Fischer died on April 12, 1997, at the age of 78. His funeral was held in El Reno, Oklahoma. More than 200 people attended. His children spoke. Thornton Caldwell's sons spoke. Veterans from the American Legion attended and saluted. At the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, there is an exhibit on World War II prisoner of war camps. One display case contains artifacts from Fort Reno, Oklahoma. A prisoner uniform with PW stenciled on the back in white paint. A work log showing daily assignments and pay vouchers. A menu from June 1944 listing fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans rolls, and apple pie. And a photograph of Carl Fisher from 1989 at age 70 wearing an American flag pin on his lapel. The placard beneath reads, "German POWs in American camps received the same rations as US troops, had access to education and recreation, and were paid for their labor. Many gained significant weight during captivity. This treatment, consistent with the Geneva Convention, stood in stark contrast to the propaganda they had been taught about American society." Most visitors read the placard and move on. But some stop, and some understand. They understand what it means when a nation feeds its enemies better than those enemies were fed by their own government, what it says about values, about civilization, about the difference between propaganda and reality. On the wall beside the display case hangs a larger photograph. Carl Fisher in 1956, on his wedding day to Josephine Brennan. He wears a suit. She wears a white dress. They are standing on the porch of the Caldwell Ranch. Thornton Caldwell stands beside them, smiling, one hand on Fisher's shoulder. 3 generations are in that photograph. An American rancher, a former German soldier, an American schoolteacher, all together, all smiling, all proving that people can change, that enemies can become friends, that the worst hatred can be overcome by the simplest kindness. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, barely visible, is a small detail. On the porch railing sits a bar of soap. White, ordinary, unremarkable. Caldwell had placed it there as a joke. Fisher had laughed when he saw it. Josephine had asked what was funny. "That bar of soap changed my life," Fisher had said. "And I'm still not entirely sure how." Carl Fisher died on April 12, 1997, at the age of 78. On his gravestone in El Reno, Oklahoma, his family inscribed the words he had requested: "Carl Fisher, 1919 to 1997. I came here expecting death. I found life instead." Below that, in smaller letters, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather, prisoner of war, American citizen, good man." The last line was added by Thornton Caldwell's sons. Fisher had not asked for it. But when they told Josephine what they wanted to add, she wept and said yes, because it was true. Carl Fisher had been a good man, not perfect, not without guilt, not without regrets, but good. And in the end, that is what mattered. Not the uniform he had worn, not the oaths he had sworn, not the ideology he had once believed, just the man he had chosen to become. The measure of a civilization is not found in its propaganda or its military might. It is found in a bar of soap given to a prisoner, in hot water flowing from a shower, in a rancher sharing his ladle with enemy soldiers, in an old man inviting young enemies to his table on a holiday, in the choice to treat human beings as human beings even when you do not have to, especially when you do not have to. Carl Fisher learned that lesson in Oklahoma in 1943, and he carried it with him for 54 years. Until the day he died, he never forgot the moment everything changed, the moment he turned on a shower and felt hot water, the moment he realized that everything he had been told was wrong, the moment he understood that civilization was not about power or purity or national glory. It was about kindness, simple, inexplicable, transformative kindness.